So this evening, what we're going to start off with, and it also gives an opportunity for people to join, is a slightly didactic section called the Advocacy Toolkit on the Neuro-behavioural science of prejudice and queer phobia. And I'm just going to introduce myself to give you a little bit of a clue on why we are why I've decided to include this. So for those of you who haven't met me, I'm a family physician at Makiwane Hospital in Mdantsane, and I'm also employed by Walter Sisulu University as a senior lecturer. So I've got students and interns and various young doctors that I'm supervising. And my involvement in terms of the gender-affirming healthcare guidelines has been mainly through I'm the convener for the Diploma of HIV Management with the college, and I'm the coordinator for the HIV Clinician Society here in East London. And so I've been part of the online training that's been rolled out on the gender affirming guidelines. And I've been helping to set up and create workshops on the gender affirming healthcare guidelines specifically for East London. So I'm sitting on the boards of both the Sexual Association of Southern Africa, as well as the Professional Association of Transgender Health. And that's partly I've got quite a long history in terms of adolescent care and sexual health. But the biggest reason why I'm actually involved here and talking about PRIDE is because of my two gorgeous and extraordinary queer kids. And it's got the history behind it has already started a couple of years ago when my eldest decided to set up a gender and sexuality alliance at the high school they were at the time, and very enthusiastically went and approached the management of the school, and we had a rather difficult year and a half as we battled with the school to try and set up a GSA, and we were not successful. Cut a long story short, and had our sort of first encounter with just quite an educational facility here in East London. So out of that, though, the great thing that happened was my eldest then inspired us to start a Gender and Sexuality Alliance for Buffalo City. As a community-based organization, we're a non-financial organization, meaning we don't have a bank account, we don't even have a chairperson. We are a bunch of volunteers with a WhatsApp group and a Facebook page, and we are just passionate about building community. And that's sort of where we are coming from. The other thing that happened is that I was recently, as a family, we went to visit my sister in the UK during June, and of course June is Pride Month, so we had the privilege of attending the Pride March in Rome, as well as seeing all the activities that's going on in the UK. And I particularly had an experience of walking down the main road in Bromley. And every third or fourth shop, there would be a Pride flag in the window or some sort of Pride support activities or Pride merchandise for sale. And I noticed with my youngest how every time we spotted a rainbow, they walked a little bit more upright. And I had this really strong experience of what it's like just to be affirmed on that level. And then, of course, coming back to East London, the first things we're seeing is the newspapers from Kobega, where there was two shops on two different occasions that was putting anti-queer posters in their windows. Both of those have now all been taken down, and really had this experience in East London where the queer community is still largely very invisible. And so from this, I discovered my children said they wanted to have a Pride festival in East London, but I realized we need one in East London. And one of the biggest things, I think, the challenge that we face as a queer community is this challenge of prejudice. And as I'm a doctor, if I was trying to tackle diabetes, I would be teaching about the pancreas and insulin. And if we're going to be tackling prejudice, which all of you are working with every single day, then we actually have to understand the science of bad behavior. Where does prejudice come from? And can we understand how this fits into human behavior? So that's basically what I'm going to be covering today. I'm going to be covering some good old-fashioned neuroscience, and it's neuroscience that I actually cover in lots of other presentations that I do as a family physician around dealing with patients who are difficult, around dealing with patient-centered care, around dealing with mentoring and teaching. All of this science is actually valid, and so I'm hoping we'll also find it helpful when we're looking at advocacy. So what I always start off with is this realization, and I think most of us sort of know it, but we forget, is that when you go through your day, your sort of 16-hour day at work, at home, etc., you are physiologically always in one of two modes. Your body physiologically switches between one of two modes. And the mode on the left here, I'm going to call survival mode. And this mode obviously comes into play whenever we're feeling slightly threatened. It's it's sort of an evolutionary mechanism that we have. And you can see the limbic brain is typically in charge when we're in survival mode, and our sympathetic nervous system is usually in predominance. And for those of you a little bit medical, you'll know that, it puts your blood pressure up and your heart rate up. And whenever we talk about anxiety and panic, for example, we'll talk about this survival mode and how it affects the body. When the survival mode is quiet, so when we don't have adrenaline in the system, then we're on creative mode. And then this prefrontal cortex comes into action, which is much later in our development. So the prefrontal cortex is developed later in the evolution of the human being. Our parasympathetic nervous system is in charge. And what happens is in this scenario, it's not an either or. When we're in creative mode, we have access to our whole brain. So the prefrontal cortex leads, but we now have access to both the limbic system and also the big cerebral cortexes. And of course, there's a switch between these two on the mode that you're in. You're either in survival mode when there's adrenaline in your system, and when you don't have adrenaline in your system, you're in creative mode. Now, I think most of us who's learned about anxiety and panic will know that our body changes, right? So your blood pressure changes, your heart rate changes, depending on which mode you're in. But what we forget is that it changes the way we think and the way we behave. And I'm going to spend a bit of time in understanding what those two worlds look like. So just a little reminder on what might trigger the switch, and it's always got to do with issues of safety. So we will always make adrenaline when we feel slightly threatened, and we can either feel threatened on a physical level, so that's when you're on the highway and a taxi pulls in front of you, or you could feel unsafe on an emotional level. So that's any scenario where somebody excludes you or is disrespectful of you, or actually in scenarios where somebody is emotionally abusing you, for example. But very, very relevant for us as well is whenever we feel that our freedom of expression is in some ways being curtailed, if we're not able to be ourselves. So in any of those scenarios, we feel slightly threatened, we're going to make some adrenaline, and we're probably going to find ourselves in survival mode. So what does this look like? Nice little busy slide. On the left here, we're going to go through how our thinking, feeling, and actions get influenced when we're in survival mode. And on the right-hand side, we're going to look a little bit at what happens when we're in creative mode. And the books that I'm drawing on is Daniel Kahneman has written an amazing book called Thinking Fast and Slow that looks at how our brains get influenced by these different modes. And he particularly looks at bias, very interesting for those of you that are medical. And then there's an amazing book by Daniel Siegel called Mindsight, which is about helping us learn how to live more from this creative brain view. So let's just get a little bit into these two worlds and start having a feeling of what they like. So when we're on survival brain, I like to call this street view, and you can imagine you are in one of those video games where you're sitting, you're busy fighting baddies and you're running down the road, and all you can really see, because you're in survival mode, is what's happening right in front of you and make decisions about the present moment. And when we're in survival mode, there are three main drives that kicks in. So the one is we're trying to avoid pain. So this is our fight-flight system. We obviously seek pleasure. So there are 5 things that are very important to the survival brain: food, sex, power, troop is our family or our nation, and security. So those are 5 basic drives every single human being has. And you can imagine in somewhere like the Ukraine, very much sitting on this level of power and troop and security. And then if we're not in one of those 2 modes on the survival brain, we have the I can't be asked, or, I don't really feel like it mode that we all can have. And we actually have a natural sort of, on an endocrinological level, a natural tendency to like to preserve our energy. So the kind of thing that happens in our thinking when we're in street view is we get very fast emotional thinking. So we have to make decisions quickly because there might be a risk. So we make assumptions, we jump to conclusions. And this kind of thinking is quite unstable, inconsistent, changes from day to day, depending on what's going on. And it's powerful. That's our go-to. When we make a quick decision, that's what we're going to be using, is this emotional thinking. And it's not the cleverest part of ourselves. So if you want to imagine what conversations look like when you are in this kind of thinking, you only need to look at social media and you will see exactly what that's like. So the analogy I like to use is I would like you to imagine that the way that this limbic brain and this prefrontal cortex interact is like a dragon with a dragon rider. And when the dragon is in charge, so we're supposed to be controlling this dragon. And if we're not controlling this dragon, then we are in dragon mode. And the dragon mode very much works on fun, works in the present. So the dopamine reward system kicks in there. It's very self-focused, both proud and insecure all at the same time. Very paranoid and vigilant. So remember, this is survival mode. So we're very much looking at how do I keep myself safe? And this word, emotive judgment, which is what we see so strongly on social media. And for those of you working within the advocacy spheres and looking after vulnerable populations, you know what extraordinary suffering gets caused by the emotive judgment that we find so often on social media. And this kind of mode, so when we're in survival brain mode, limbic brain in charge, this is when things can become aggressive, when people can become dangerous, and whenever you're seeing there's conflict or there is suffering taking place with people injuring each other, you can be sure that that person at that stage is in survival mode. So what does it look like on the opposite side? So now we have this prefrontal cortex that came much later in our human evolution. And the point of the prefrontal cortex is nothing to do with survival. This asks the question about what is the purpose of things? What is the meaning of things? What is important to me? What do I value? And sometimes some of those can even be in conflict with what is important to the so-called dragon. So I like to call this the balcony view. So again, if you imagine the street view with the in the video game and the balcony view, you're now actually standing looking out over a city, and you're able to be able to see forward what's going to happen. You can able to see what's happened in the past, and you can have perspective about what's happening. And the prefrontal cortex has got 4 different parts, and there's 4 major functions. So it's in charge of executive functions, so all the planning that happens, both being able to review your past and plan your future. It's our ability to reflect on what is happening, and also even reflect on what's happening within our own survival mode. This is where our ability to be empathic lies. So we have these mirror neurons where you can look at somebody else or listen to somebody and actually have an inkling of what they must be experiencing. And note, when you're in survival mode, you have no access to empathy. You have no access to that higher part of yourself. And this is also where we're able to have self-control. So sitting yourself down to study for exam, even when you don't feel like it, saying no to that extra dessert, even when you desperately want to have it. Those are all functions that belongs to that higher part of our brain. So this kind of thinking is different. This is slow thinking. It's the kind of thinking you use when you do maths, and it really requires focus and attention and effort. So to be able to really look at information and see all the different grays and see all the different perspectives and understand all the different aspects of it takes effort. You literally burn more sugar if we were to take an MRI of your brain. But now you're able to see things in context. Now one has much more perspective. And this is where we're really able to be our most intelligent selves. But this is much slower than that powerful, stupid thinking that we so happily engage with when we're on Facebook. So would you like you to imagine now this dragon master, and Daniel Siegel calls this ability of mindsight when you have this dragon under control. And what happens is that we have particular qualities that now becomes possible when we're in this mode. So this is when we're able to be compassionate and tolerant towards others. This is where we're able to be conscious of ourselves. We have our conscience as well. We're able to be humble and generous to others. And this is where we're at our most creative and innovative. So this is where you actually see people doing amazing stuff. And when you're doing amazing work and you're having amazing, interaction with your child or an amazing interaction with a client, then you're definitely sitting in this mode. And this is a term from Brené Brown that I absolutely love. And for me is the counterfooter of this emotive judgment, being generous in our assumptions. And I always think, imagine what social media would be like if we were able to bring this generosity to our commenting rather than this extraordinary emotive judgment. And this is where we're really able to be healing and loving. And I think within all of your, as organizations and people who are involved within the LGBTQIA plus communities, these are the kind of people we meet. This is where we are operating from when we are supporting those communities. So what happens is we're going to look a little bit in detail at this dragon. And this dragon, when we are in dragon mode, when we're in survival mode and the limbic brain is in charge and we're feeling anxious, we don't like feeling anxious. The body doesn't like it. And it has these mechanisms to reduce anxiety. So we have these 3 evolutionary mechanisms that we use to try and manage our anxiety and make us feel like we've got some sort of control over what's happening. And we quite often form them in childhood. So when you're little and, you know, your parent comes home and maybe they're aggressive or drunk, you might run off and go and hide under the bed. And that's quite an appropriate response. But now as an adult and you're having an argument with your wife and you go and hide under the bed, that might not be such an ideal response to a situation. So they're very good in physical threats. They might have made more sense when we were little, but now we still have these habits of what we do when we are feeling stressed. And we can either try and fight it, we can either freeze up and try and negotiate a situation, or we can try and flee it. And these wonderful drawings was done by my eldest child, who's showing us those 3 dragons. And we're going to go a little bit through some of these mechanisms because this is quite fun. We all have particular little things that we use when we are trying to manage our anxiety. And for those of you who want to read more about it and want to actually do a little online questionnaire to find out about your own saboteurs, I would recommend to look up Shazad Chamin and Positive Intelligence, where he describes these in detail. So some people like to fight and battle when they are feeling anxious. And the most common thing, which I think everybody does, is when we're feeling a little bit anxious, is to criticize. And the criticizing is not necessarily logical or necessarily even relevant to what is happening, but it makes us feel better. So those of us who work in government, we love to complain about government whenever we feel anxious, whether we are being rational or not. The other thing is, and this we find a lot with the doctors, is by overanalyzing. So either lecturing or advising or having all kinds of opinions, even if it's on something you know absolutely nothing about. And those of us who are very organized, you'll see in brackets there are sort of the strength that might lead to you using that particular mechanism to reduce your anxiety, or trying to manipulate the situation and manipulate other people to make you feel like you're actually controlling what's happening. And you can see that these particular mechanisms, whenever you see queer phobia, and especially if you're seeing aggression, these 3 are coming into play. So, and what's important to remember is if somebody's in survival mode and they're going on a full-on attack, for example, on social media, or they're trying to manipulate the information that they, for example, have been presented. We see that a lot with detransitioning, for example, or if you've got somebody who's giving you long lectures about something they know absolutely nothing about, that when people are doing this, they are actually in survival mode, and you're not dealing necessarily with a highly intelligent person at that moment. So the temptation is to try now get into a rational conversation, and you would usually find that dragons do not respond well to rational conversations, and we have this frustration on how do we manage this these attacks. So another mechanism to try and reduce anxiety, and we all combine different ones of these in different scenarios, but for people who are quite kind and who doesn't like conflict, will quite often go into a pleasing mode, and they will sacrifice themselves and try and say the right things and try and be nice and try and be diplomatic, but they might not actually look after their own needs. And especially those in the nursing professions or those that are involved in caring professions tend to have this as a common methodology of trying to deal with their worries. Some people get very perfectionistic and try and get over perfectionistic in terms of managing with their anxiety. And then one that I think we all do when you're anxious is this tendency to start worrying about all kinds of things. So that's when you're lying in the middle of the night and your brain is churning away, and of course the only things you can think of is all the things that's a threat. So you're not exactly being very intelligent or rational about it, but your adrenaline is actually producing all these thoughts. And the word I'd like to use for these methods are queer tolerance, and quite a lot of the microaggressions lie in this. So these are people who come to you and have their concerns about particular aspects of things they know absolutely nothing about, or you get people who are being very nice to your face, but asking all these sort of strange, inappropriate questions about what is going on. So quite often here you feeling you're not having somebody that's outright attacking you, and they will actually even say they're supportive and they're on your side, but you can feel that they are not actually being affirming. So the third mechanism is the classic flight to try and reduce anxiety. So these are actually people who just don't talk about the topic or just ignore it completely. There are those that obviously feel sorry for themselves and not dealing with what's happening, and people who are distracting themselves when they feel anxious. And those are at the root of a lot of our addictions. And these are quite important when you're dealing with clients. So a lot of our clients that we deal with obviously has been under threat and felt unsafe in lots of scenarios. and they will also be using mechanisms to deal with their anxiety. And these are particularly tricky when you are trying to engage somebody in therapy or treatment, and for example, they just don't show up for appointments, or they're just not engaging with the work. And I would almost queer avoidance. So it's people who just actually not deal with the issue. They don't read up about it. They don't understand it. They don't ask questions about it. And they try and ignore that part of the population. So the goal is, as human beings, is the integration of this master in dragon. And I love this picture from Benji, because you can see that it's not necessarily an easy integration. It takes quite a thing to keep that dragon under control. But if we're able to get integration, that's when we become coherent, energized, adaptive, flexible, stable. And these are all qualities that you can see in somebody who's able to affirm those around you. And that's where we want to get to as a population. So you can see in the top right here, I've got a summary of the 9 little methodologies we all use to manage our anxiety. And now I want you to imagine, let's imagine we're in a meeting, right? As NGOs and organizations, we all attend way too many meetings. And you're in a scenario where a colleague might be lecturing or advising you. So that's from that top layer, or trying to manipulate you into something, or meeting every suggestion with negativity. So worry about everything you're bringing up, or maybe ignoring you, or not letting you speak, or not listening to what you're saying. So these are all mechanisms that somebody is using who's not feeling safe, who's slightly anxious, and they are using these methodologies because it makes them feel like they're controlling their anxiety. It's very unconscious. But what, of course, happens is if somebody does this in a scenario like this, it makes you feel unsafe. And so your own dragon comes to the party. And that's when you get those wonderful dragon wars. Those are those difficult, awkward conversations where you can feel that things are just roller coasting out of control. And in advocacy, we know these scenarios very well. When we're on scenarios when we're trying to approach or speak to people, and we find ourselves with them and us in dragon mode. So when we're talking about how to train your dragon, there's a lovely books and movies about this. This is actually a lifelong journey that you can imagine. You've got the survival brain, which is this beautiful, powerful, stupid dragon that is there to keep you safe and sort of screen what's happening around you. And then you have this dragon master that needs to learn to control and steer and guide that dragon. And I've got quite a few presentations on how that develops, for example, over adolescenthood and our whole lives, really, this process of development. So we're not going to do in a lot of detail in terms of the management, but there's some things to consider when you are dealing with somebody who's in dragon mode. And I'm just going to share 3 top tips here. And the biggest one is being able to be aware that we have these 2 modes. Most often what happens is when you end up behaving in a way where later you're feeling slightly embarrassed about it, or you sort of think to yourself, why did I do that? Or why did I say that? Or why did I behave like that? Is that's very useful to start understanding, oh, okay, that was me in survival mode, and I was not my fully integrated self in that moment. And then in the beginning, one can just reflect, being able to look back on stuff and being able to understand what happened. But the ultimate goal is being able to be in a scenario where you're in a scenario and you can feel the conversation's not going well, and to realize, okay, hold on, which mode am I in? Am I on survival mode now, or am I on balcony view? Which view am I on? And being able to also then recognize and understand what's happening with the other person. And very important, if the other person is in dragon mode, now you've got to realize, never, ever try and arm wrestle that dragon. And what I mean with that, it is bringing your own dragon to the party. So if you start lecturing or advising or trying to outsmart or manipulate or find all these clever things you think you're going to tell, no matter how good your rationality is, no matter how good your arguments are, it always ends up being a disastrous conversation. And the challenges with people when they are in dragon mode is they cannot listen. They're not going to hear what you're saying. And at that moment, they're not going to be able to engage with that conversation. And it's important to be able to recognize that to keep yourself safe. So that's the 3rd step, is being able to create safety. And firstly, for yourself. So yourself being integrated does not mean you're Mr. Nice Guy. It means being able to have this balcony view of what's happening and doing what's the best for that scenario. And we all know that there's certain scenarios where you just need to actually leave and get out of that scenario and create safety for yourself. But if you're in a scenario where you're feeling fairly safe and you're in balcony mode, you have this balcony view superpower, which is compassion. So if you're wondering, and this is particularly true if you're dealing with clients, so say you've got a child who's quite stressed or anxious or freaked out, or you're dealing with a colleague who's quite anxious or stressed or freaked out, and you're thinking, okay, I can't bring my dragon to the party, so what am I supposed to do? What we want is that person to feel safe. And compassion is the biggest way of doing it. Being able to be gracious in our assumptions. Okay, he's just having a little bit too much adrenaline, having a meltdown. We all do that. And bringing compassion to that moment and being able to create safety through listening and care. Actually, it's not guaranteed, but you've got a much better chance of helping that dragon to calm down and helping the person to get their own reins back than you do if you bring your own dragon to the party. So how is this going to help us a little bit when we think about advocacy? And I want to look at all of the elements that we have seen that's made up PRIDE over the years. And I want you to imagine until the late 1960s, if you looked at the whole world, there was nowhere in the entire world where the queer community could live themselves, be themselves, and live proudly within their communities. And there was an expectation from communities that people who were queer was supposed to live in the shadows and was put in a position of shame and being put into the closet. And then in the late 60s in America, it started, there was this first wonderful resurgence of community that was starting to say, no, we will not be in the shadows. We want to be, we need to be able to be proud of who we are and live proudly within society. So over the years, this PRIDE advocacy has grown, and you would like to think, God, you know, this was 50 years ago when this all started. Surely by now we should be a lot further along than we are. And I think it's a bit concerning when you're looking in their world out there that we are seeing a lot of dragon coming into play. So I'm going to look at 4 components. And what we're doing tonight is having a stakeholder meeting to look at what we want to bring for Pride Month to East London specifically, or to Buffalo City. And there's very many different ways of engaging with it. So the way it started was visibility, for queer communities to be able to live in pride and to be visible within our communities and to be able to be proud and visible within our communities. And I think I had this experience when we were in how powerful it was in the UK to have this experience of being able to walk down a road and feel this affirmation on a regular basis. And in East London at the moment, there might be lots of communities who are supportive, but we don't actually know which businesses or communities or places are supportive of our communities. Very important is the political activism, and that's sort of at the core of PRIDE, where we want to start influencing laws and policies. I'm going to talk to each of these in a minute. And then another aspect of PRIDE is actually working through the education sphere, sensitization, raising awareness, and just teaching communities about what is happening. So one of the big challenges always is that what people don't know makes things more uncertain. And when they don't know something and they're uncertain about something, they're more likely to go into this dragon mode, and you see this prejudice. And then how do we integrate this all into one connected event? So I'm going to do something interesting. I want to do a quick poll, and I want to imagine if we look at East London as a community, right? And we imagine I've got a little bit of a Likert scale here, right? So on the left here, how much of our population in East London expect queer community to still live in shame? And how much do we think East London, what percentage population in East London affirm the queer community to live in pride? Ooh, where it says Saturn, that's more than 80%. So I'm just going to bring up a poll here. And if you're not able to do the poll because you're on a certain device or whatever, so you'll see then, so don't ignore the first question, sorry, my polling. In that second question there, in the Buffalo City Metro, what proportion of the population do you think support the LGBTQIA plus community? This is obviously not a research. And you can give a rough indication. If you're not able to put it in the poll, then please put it in the chat. Do you think less than 20% of the population support our communities, 20 to 40%, 40 to 60%, 60 to 80%, or more than 80% of East London supports our LGTBQIA plus community? So yeah, if you don't see the poll for whatever reason, you can also put in the code. Yes,
we can't submit because if you don't do one, you can't do two.
Oh, okay. So just do one. Thank you. Well done. Excellent. So just choose something arbitrarily on one. Thank you. Well done. Thank you very much. So yes, we're getting some. Great. We've got one person very optimistic. Excellent. So this would be an interesting study, right? In terms of, and you can see most people are sitting, we're about 3 and 2, sitting that half or possibly less than half of population. It obviously depends on your area that you are staying. I'm going to give it 1 or 2 more people to participate, and then I'm going to show you the results. And this would be an interesting project at some stage anyway, in terms of trying to. Great. So this is what we have seen. And you can see there's one person that thinks it's 20 to 40%, about 3 people thinking it's about 40 to 60%, one person 60 to 80, and one person very optimistic. More than 80% of people in East London support the LGBTQIA plus community. And it might very well be true. We don't actually know. And I think one of the challenges, well, I'm not sure if you can see that result. Hold on. There we go. Now you should hopefully be able to see the result. And one of the challenges is when you speak to people from the LGBTQIA plus community is we don't know. We don't know which places are safe to go into. We don't know which places somebody might decide to say something or raise an eyebrow, or where we can live proud of who we are. So this challenge of not knowing is how do we start making it visible for those in the communities that do support the queer community. And this is one of the campaigns. This is probably the one thing the GSA will continue to do during the Pride Month. We've started this in June, but this just goes on forever. And what we've done is we've created this poster. There's a QR code for those of you who want to download this poster. You can put your own logos on it, so you can brand it any way you want. There's one that's adjustable. And what we have found is that, for example, I was in the post office and I had a poster and I was like, oh, can we put this up? And they're like, yeah, sure. And then I was in the police station this is in Beacon Bay, and I was like, oh, can we put one up? Yeah, sure. And CMH Hospital, we put them up all over all the waiting rooms. And there I have had this experience that I have not had any businesses that's pushed back and gone and said, no, we don't want that poster in our, and just imagine walking down, I don't know, Hemingway's or Vincent Mall or Mdantsane Mall, and seeing these posters, even if it's just, every third shop, already what a different experience that is from what we've been seeing in places like Gqeberha. So very important is political activism. So it started off with just this very important thing of we are here and we are not going away, but then we have to start influencing policy, guidelines, etc. So very important is the first step with political activism is actually looking at the overarching laws of the country. And South Africa in 1994 was actually one of the first ones, and one of the very few in the world where it's strongly embedded in our constitution. And one of the challenges is where it's not in the constitution is we are seeing countries that are reversing some of the decisions that have been made in the past. So, for example, a very conservative government has just come into Italy. So when we were at the Rome Pride, one of the great focuses with that was the fact that they were busy changing the laws and prohibiting adopted children to be recognized from same-sex couples. And it's sort of frightening that a country, just depending on who's in government, can suddenly start to undo some of the work that's been done before. But of course, it doesn't help. You've got it all in the constitution, but it's not actually reflected down on policy level, both on governmental sector, NGO sector, private sector, is what is said within our constitution actually reflecting in policies. And there needs to be activism and to check that this is actually happening. And of course, it doesn't help where there's a lot of lip talk. Better word for that, I'm sure. Quite often there's a lot of lip service, that's the word, sorry, lip service towards, yes, we want to protect the rights and we want to encourage our LGBTQI plus communities. But if you haven't actually put it in your strategic frameworks and you haven't actually budgeted for it, then it's not going to happen. And the reality is, if you're thinking in terms of equity, it's not just about saying, oh, we'll treat everybody the same. We actually have to take more effort, and there has to be more budgeting and strategies put in place to create safety for our queer communities. So in the world of healthcare and guidelines, there's actually been the activism, we've actually had real success. So if you look at the overall arching medical science, and I'm talking here specifically about the WHO and the huge international ways in which we classify disease, like with the ICD, the International Classification of Disease. In 2019, the WHO actually at assembly stated that being trans is not a mental health disorder. And so there has been, medicine has had to undo, depathologize this sort of horrific history that we have of having actually written a lot of the queer identities into medical diagnoses. So that's great. So in healthcare, in our guidelines, we have this amazing gender affirming healthcare guideline. There's amazing guidelines and strategies around key populations and what needs to happen. But it doesn't help that this is all written in these guidelines and they're not actually happening on the ground within facilities. And we're certainly seeing that at the moment in East London, that there's not yet much awareness on the ground, even though these amazing guidelines exist, and that needs activism. Also, in terms of protections, so both the human rights hate speech bill, there's a lot going. Also, now, if we have this legal framework, how do we actually ensure that it's happening, and that's also linked to then accountability. So, are we actually implementing the laws as they've been written? And then lastly, in terms of education, we want to be able to also start sensitizing East London communities. And I generally find, I've gone and been doing quite a bit of teaching in schools, for example, is that when you're talking to teachers and when you're actually interacting with people on the ground, there is a curiosity and interest and quite a lot of openness. And most of the prejudice that we've been meeting in the schools has been largely based on ignorance. So we'd like to encourage organizations to get involved in going and doing little talks or little educational sessions for Pride Month. This can be in healthcare facilities, so I'll be very involved in that from the HIV Clinician Society, both in public and private settings. We'd like to go and do talks at schools, seeing what's happening in our local universities and colleges. I'm quite keen to make sure WUSU gets on board. We need to look at organizations. It'd be great to go and have a meeting with Vincent and Hemingway's and Matansane malls and looking at things like toilets, for example, and more representation. And then very much also being involved. There's a lot of amazing community projects out there already happening, sharing things on radio, social media. Our NGOs getting very involved also in that sphere. And that GSA, I think, well, where we've mostly gone, and I think I'm very inspired by the Treatment Action Campaign story, where one of their biggest ways that they've been dealing with stigmatization and providing access of care for people with HIV was by educating our communities so that they could get to the point of understanding the needs and being able to actually advocate for the needs for their communities. So we are very keen. The fourth aspect that I was talking about is integration, and that's where the GSA would like to contribute in terms of helping to plan Pride. As I say, we don't get any funding, we don't have any financial structures, and what we would love to do is help all the different organizations and just create this one marketing banner. So one Facebook page, one event calendar. And we would like all the organizations to keep their own identities within that. So everybody can decide what do they want to bring to a Pride festival, Pride March, and what aspects we are going to bring. And therefore from us, it's more about how we link all of these different organizations, because also even within all worlds, the dragon can raise its head, and sometimes you find people struggle to work together, and we're hoping we can help with that. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. And what I'm visualizing for October is a Pride Tapestry with lots of different components. And the components are going to be decided by the stakeholders that get involved. The only thing that we have set up so far, and Sikandar will talk a little bit about that, is a date for the Pride March. And the Pride March for me, very much that's very much on the activism side. We'll need to look at what we're exactly marching for on that day. But I want it to not be linked too much to the festival party side of things, so to speak. So that needs to be an alcohol-free event that involves families and children's and organizations. We need to have a memorandum that we can be presenting at that march, for example, and will probably be more of a morning event. But then linked to that, if one wants to have, for example, a party on one of the other dates, anything is possible. So it's really to start looking at what different people want to bring to that Pride Festival. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm hoping that warms us up a little bit and get us excited about all the possibilities. What we're going to do now is we're going to just introduce each of us. I want to just go around